So our goal here today is to try to cram about 3 hours of information into 30 minutes. So we've been doing a fair number, and Tom and Colin certainly have been in this area of trying to put educational opportunities together to talk about FAD and producer preparedness. You know, with a huge thank you to Jamie and IPPA. They formed a foreign animal disease task force. They've been able to provide us with some resources to be able to put this kind of educational stuff together. So because we're on such a time crunch, what you're going to see is we'll go through, we'll try to give a quick update where it is, what does the response look like, what are things that you can be working on now in peacetime rather than trying to scurry and scramble and put things together in wartime if we ever get to wartime. So you're going to see as we go through, I'm going to really try to point you back to a lot of materials that Amanda Chipman and Kristen Olson, who's in the back there, wave to everybody, Kristen. Kristen is another resource person for you. We've tried to put a lot of these together, these resources together on the website too, so you can pick and choose different pieces to look through as if you're looking for a specific question on feed ingredients or premise identification or things like that. So we'll just try to cover, like, say, real brief here. I'm going to try to pull up a video that talks about the response, just to give you an idea of what some of those short videos look like. We really tried to take that 3-hour workshop and break it down, because we realize it's hard to get people off the farm, hard for them to sit there for 3 hours. But we tried to chop it up because we know adult learners are very visual based, and they tend to be pretty short attention spans too, right? So admittedly, so I'm as guilty as any of you guys would be, but you know, like 3 to 5 minutes, that's what people can digest around the topic. So we'll play one of those for you just to give some idea of it. But I'd encourage you to go to the website and really just kind of dig through it. So ASF. So a little bit about the virus. Started in the early 1900s. You know, it was a disease in Africa and warthogs and bush hogs and wild pigs there for most of the 20th century. And then in 2007, it took a jump either on in contaminated food products, or two stories, either from a airline or from a cruise ship, where they took some of the garbage from those two places and fed it to some backyard pigs and infected them, and then those infected pigs got out to other pigs, and then they got into the wild boar population and started there. Well, in 2018, to the best of our knowledge, it took a big old jump and got into this northeastern part of China, and then really over the next 9 months raced across that country, and then now really started to affect the other countries in Southeast Asia, because these borders are really nothing more than lines on a map, right? So, and there's a lot of people, pigs, product that gets moved between those. So, and you can see all of these Southeast Pacific islands have also been infected. So, you know, we're really kind of on the fire line. Does anybody know a little set of islands here that's just off that map? It's Hawaii, right? So, and if you kind of watch, it's kind of move this direction and then kind of around the horn of these Southeast Pacific Island nations that are all infected now. So if we look at ASF in Europe, like we said, it's kind of started along some of these seaports and moved into, now they have a much bigger, much more prominent wild boar population. That's all the green triangles that you see on the screen there. You know, worked up through the Eastern European bloc countries into Russia, now slowly working its way west towards where more of the commercial production in Europe is produced. You've got Denmark here that produces a lot of pigs. About 2/3 of the wean pigs that they produce, either as wean pigs or feeder pigs, come into Germany and Poland and France and places like that to feed out. So obviously these countries have been very concerned about it. Denmark just finished a 44-kilometer long and wide and a 5-meter high fence to try to keep wild boars out. And now most recently here you see on the map here is they started to find ASF and a bunch of wild boars right along the German border, about 10 kilometers or about 6 to 7 miles away from the German border. So they're rapidly trying to erect a fence too. So really, if we look at it from a North America standpoint, it's kind of moving in from both coasts, really in the truest sense. So let's talk a little bit more about China. China produces 50% of the pigs worldwide. So officially they said, the government would say, well, we've only had about 163 cases with 1.2 million pigs. We know that that number is much higher than that. We're talking about thousands of cases. The Chinese breeding inventory, we know that only because they do report that year over year. They won't say why it decreased, but from March of 2018 to March of 2019, they saw each by the provinces decrease their breeding inventory by 40 to 60% in that time frame. So it probably lost somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 15 million sows. The size of the U.S. breeding herd is about 6.2 million sows, just as a reference. So coincidentally enough, then that's 50 to 60% of their inventory, right? So you got 50% of the pigs in the world are raised by China, and 50% of that production is gone. That's 25% of the pigs produced in the world was essentially evaporated in about a year's time period. So that equates to about 300 to 400 million pigs lost. So, their industry is obviously very decimated. What are they trying to do? They're trying to, clean those farms, and then they're trying to repopulate them after about 30, 40 days. But unfortunately, because this virus lives for a very long time outside the pig, particularly in infected pork products, blood, things like that, also into some food thing that we'll talk about here in a second. The repopulation has not been very successful, so it's been about a 70 to 90% failure rate. What they're trying to do instead on the farms that haven't been infected is they're trying to do a test and remove strategy rather than, okay, we've got one pig, so we got to eliminate and eradicate the whole farm. They're actually just going in and testing them, removing the sick animals, then testing the rest of them to see if they're able to keep the rest of the herd clean that way. So just a little bit more about African swine fever. It's a very large, very complex virus. There really hasn't been a whole lot of research done worldwide on it because it didn't really get into major pig producing countries until about 2007. The country of Spain had to deal with a little bit in the 1960s, but it was a much milder strain than what we're dealing with today. But as we said, it's very hardy. It's extremely stable in the environment, so it lives for a long time outside the animal. It also survives in undercooked meat. Now, you can kill it with the cooking temperatures of 150 to 160 degrees, but these salted hams or these cured pork type products, kind of the ready to use off the shelf type stuff, it lives perfectly fine for a very long time in any of those products. So much so, they think actually in both countries, in both Asia and in Europe, they think that's one of the primary methods that the virus is being spread around. We had a German epidemiologist speak a few years ago, and he said, yeah, African swine fever is a pig disease, but it's a human problem. Okay, so it is a disease, and we'll go through that here in a little bit. It's really one that the people are moving around with some of these situations where we're moving these contaminated pork products and they're getting back into pigs, and also with the lack of really good biosecurity. Unfortunately, the biggest problem with it is it's currently no vaccine or treatment available for that at all. Importantly, this one, along with classical swine fever or foot and mouth disease, would be a trade restricting disease. So even if all we ever had was one pig in a backyard lot in California, that would be enough to immediately shut off trade, which means we'd have 25% more pork on the domestic market. So pork would get really cheap in a short time period. One thing just to remember about this, to make sure we're talking to friends and neighbors when we get asked questions about it, it's not a public health or food safety concern. You can eat these contaminated sausages all day long and nothing will happen to people. This is only a pig disease. Pigs are the only species impacted by it. So what about vaccines? Haven't been working on it real long. It's a really big virus, so we're not sure what parts and pieces of that virus yet makes a good kill vaccine. So early on, some of the experts would say, man, we're probably years to decades away from an effective kill vaccine. So instead of that, they're turning to other vaccines, like maybe we'd have with a PRRS vaccine, which is a modified live vaccine. So they take a strain, they attempt to manipulate the genes on the inside of the strain and see if that winds up becoming a vaccine. Actually, there was a candidate, there's some news clips here you see from earlier this year. There's a candidate that we're looking at in Plum Island, which is the National Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab. And actually, what they did is they took a strain and then through some genetic manipulation, they knocked 2 of the genes out of those 140 genes. And then they exposed pigs to that. And then 30 days later, they challenged them with the bad virus to see if it would protect. And upon that initial evaluation, all the pigs, now what you got to remember, your sample size is only 5 pigs here, but all the pigs were protected against clinical disease. Okay, so they didn't get sick, they didn't get die. So very, very promising for sure. So then the natural tendency is, while the news media runs with it, hey, we got a solution. The real question is, well, how long are we from that evaluation until we got a bottle in our hand that we can do something with? Well, that was a little bit when you start digging into the details that weren't covered in the articles. But they did find a couple of things. So number one, that vaccine virus was shed from vaccinated pigs to other pigs that were in the pen or the adjacent pen. So they could still recover the vaccine virus. And even after they challenged the pigs and those pigs survived, they could still recover the challenged virus from those infected pigs. So what that means is that's probably not, those two things would not allow for that vaccine to say, okay, let's go ahead and take it to manufacturing and start producing it, right? In a negative, naive country, it's a little bit like foot and mouth. You know, we've got vaccines, but we don't use them until after a break because the vaccine will cause the tests to go positive. So today, with what this vaccine is today, you know, those are two hurdles that they got to continue to work on. They've got to make sure those two things won't happen before we'd ever have an effective vaccine. But a very, very good start for a disease that we don't even have on our shores yet. So moral of the story is, probably still going to be years before we get to a point where we'd ever have a solution that we could use in our hand. Now, let's say, you know, if we had the unfortunate event where we had an infection on the continent, this may certainly be, you know, at the point where it's infecting a lot of herds, that may be an option or solution. But today, while we don't have it, it won't be an option yet without some additional work on it. So what does African swine fever look like? So there's good news, bad news. The bad news is it looks like a lot of other stuff that we already have. And I'll show you some pictures here in a second. The good news is one thing that does make it a little bit different is these pigs have a really high fever. Very commonly to have those between 105 and 108 degrees. And we have pigs that have fever, but usually it's in that 104, maybe it reaches 105. We usually don't have things that cause 106, 107, 108 degrees fever. So what does that mean for us? Because early on, that's what it's going to look like. It's not like PED where you walked into the barn and yesterday they were fine and today every pig in the barn is scouring. It's not going to be that dramatic. It's going to be, you just got some pigs, maybe you lose a couple, don't look so good. But if we get back to doing rectal tempering and we start to train our caretakers to say, okay, we got to get back to tempering these pigs. If I get something between 106 and 108 degrees, I got to call my veterinarian right away, okay? That's going to be how we're going to detect it early enough to really make a difference. If it does get into pigs, we're going to have to recognize it early on. As the disease gets more progressed through a herd, you may see things such as bloody diarrhea or hemorrhages. It probably doesn't show up for here real well. You've kind of got purple ears, purple nose. The blood kind of pokes holes in the blood vessels, so instead of staying inside of the blood vessels, a lot of this blood starts to leak out into these other areas. So that's where you start to see them on the ears and nose. In breeding herds, the initial sign you may see is just some abortions. Sudden deaths are probably a thing that you're going to see, but early on it may just be one or two pigs, you know, something that's not terribly unusual. Eventually, left unchecked, it'll wind up killing a lot of pigs. Here's some data from a 2,400 head sow farm, one of the early farms that was infected in China. So a couple things I want you to pay attention to. So the first case was in 2 dead boars, because they collect on farm, 2 dead boars in one pen and one end of the barn, okay? And then they just kind of sat and waited. They weren't sure if they were going to depopulate or what they were going to do, so they just kind of tracked clinical signs and mortality from there on. The green line there, that's kind of the farm normal threshold for mortality. So that would be, well, we've had a couple of deaths. That's probably not an alarm. We see that occasionally, right? Well, look at the time period from the first official case until it got to a point where the farm could say, hey, something different's going on here. I got lots of sick and lots of dead pigs. Well, that period in that farm was about 2 weeks. And early on, if we didn't see the bloody diarrhea and all that stuff, we just had either some acute deaths or these pigs with purple ears. These are pigs that are infected with circovirus and salmonella, by the way, not African swine fever. But it looks an awful lot like those earlier pictures we just saw, right? But let's think about it. So what all could have happened in 2 weeks from a 2,400 head sow farm? They could be moving, you know, they could wean pigs 6 to 8 times to maybe multiple different sites. Or think about how many times that the feed mill may have delivered feed there, or we've had visitors or personnel or the gasmen or rendering. Think about all the things that could happen in a farm that size in 2 weeks before we even get any inkling at all that something's wrong, right? So that's the scary part about it, is it's not going to be a clinically apparent obvious. So once again, going back to temping sick pigs, right? Early on is really going to be one of the best weapons that we have to fight an early infection. Okay, I'm going to attempt to do this to you. So in the end of September, between USDA and the 14 largest pig states and their state animal health officials, they kind of did an ASF exercise to practice what would happen if there was a foreign animal disease diagnosed in the U.S. So this is one of the excellent videos that Kristen put together. So we're going to try to show it here. Unfortunately, I've got to jump out and jump between a couple of programs here to make that happen. Bear with me for just a second while we deal with the technical issues on that.
We will give an overview of what the government response to a foreign animal disease outbreak might look like. When planning for a disease outbreak, many things have to be taken into consideration with the complexities of both biological and political systems. The United States Department of Agriculture has a disease response strategy for African swine fever. Even though the response may not exactly follow the plans outlined in this response strategy, it is a good place to start as we try to understand what the response might look like and how we can prepare on our farms. In a disease outbreak, the goals of the government plan are to find, control, and contain the disease, eradicate the disease, and business continuity for non-infected farms. The strategy to accomplish these goals includes preventing contact between the virus and pigs in the U.S. herd, stopping the production of virus in infected animals by mass depopulation of infected herds, and stopping the transmission of the disease by vectors. Critical activities of this strategy include quarantine and movement control, biosecurity, disease monitoring, and cleaning and disinfection. Learning how to recognize a foreign animal disease is critical to recognizing and reporting the disease early. Resources for monitoring the disease can be found at www.securepork.org. Recording your animal observations will help determine if you have increasing mortality or suspicious clinical signs that could be a foreign animal disease in your barn. If signs are observed, contact your manager or veterinarian. If you have a suspicious case, regulatory officials will proceed with a foreign animal disease investigation, where a foreign animal disease diagnostician will come to your farm to collect samples for diagnostic testing. Current approved sample types are tonsils, lymph nodes, spleen, and whole blood. If the test results come back positive for a foreign animal disease, state and federal regulatory officials will restrict animal movement to slow or stop the spread of the foreign animal disease. Producers can be planning ahead by creating contingency plans if they are not able to move weaned pigs, semen, manure, rendering, feed, or market hogs. During the national standstill, officials will designate control areas around the infected premises. During this time, officials will investigate potential sources and spreading of the virus by looking at everything coming in and out of the infected farms. They will be looking for things to help identify the potential source of virus introduction, identify other premises with contact to the virus, determine risk factors for transmission, and trace previous movements on and off the farm. Making sure all your sites have a premises identification number and making all your records electronic will help speed this process up in the event of an outbreak. A foreign animal disease outbreak in the U.S. will change business for everyone, but if you are outside the control area, you will be able to move your animals as usual or without a movement permit. If your farm is infected with the foreign animal disease, your animals will be depopulated and disposed of in attempts to stop the spread and eradicate the disease from the U.S. If your animals are located in the control area but not infected with the disease, you will need to meet certain criteria in order to request a movement permit to move your animals. You will also need to work to protect your herd from getting the disease through enhanced biosecurity. Protecting your farm through enhanced biosecurity can start with designating someone to be in charge of biosecurity. They will be responsible for writing a biosecurity plan, communicating biosecurity protocols, ensuring compliance to these protocols, and reviewing the biosecurity plan. Another way to protect your herd is to add additional biosecurity measures on your farm. You can also write a site-specific biosecurity plan. Additional training for caretakers, visitors, truckers, and anyone else coming onto the farm is another way for you to prepare. Please visit our website at www.ipic.iastate.edu for more information. Thanks for watching.
All right, just give you a little flavor of what some of those videos look like. That Amanda and Chris have done a really nice job of.
What's going on? I'm Zone Down Marcus.
I'm Sunny D, Vegan Ariel.
I'm Captain Watson.
All right.
South Dakota.
Only unfortunate part about using YouTube like this
Peloton is able to take
is it doesn't pull all the other stuff up along here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. They touched on it briefly. What happens if you're the affected premise? We'll probably spend a little bit of time on that. So we talked about depopulation. So the goal really there is to find the virus quickly and to eradicate the virus quickly. So find them and eliminate the source. Well, the source is going to be pigs. Pigs are the only animal that can replicate that virus. So it's going to be find it as quick as you can and get those animals dead just as quickly as you can. So the traditional methods are going to be preferred. That's one of the things that we learned during the exercise. They're going to want you to use captive bolt or CO2 or gunshot or things like that. However, there is a provision if you're able to demonstrate that, okay, well, we can use those methods, but it's going to take 10 days to depopulate the site. Well, that doesn't really fit this goal of trying to get those animals depopulated as fast as possible. In those cases, then, USDA will allow for what's called a ventilation shutdown plus. So essentially, you'll seal the building up, and then shut the ventilation system off. The plus is either adding additional CO2 or adding additional heat to help speed up the depopulation process. So the question always comes up about, well, what happens if my site is the one that is infected? Early on, the USDA will have some money for indemnity there, but you have to fill out this entire plan. So you got to talk about what am I going to do to euthanize, what's my method of depopulation disposal, how am I eliminating the viruses, so on and so forth. So they will do that as long as that plan is approved. Indemnity must be requested prior to the depopulation. This plan must be filled out and approved. And then they only pay for pigs that are living at that time of depopulation. So a lot of the question comes in, well, how much are they going to pay? That's all yet kind of a moving target. We've heard anywhere between 50 to 100% of fair market value. Well, the question is, what's fair market value? You know, is it after an outbreak? Because we know what's going to happen to markets after an outbreak. You know, still yet to be decided. One thing I know that they were talking about was using like a 3-month rolling average and trying to base it off that. So that's probably going to be somewhat situation dependent, not really written in stone yet. Those are just some of the things that they're discussing. So what about disposing? This is probably the one where we really can't stand up to today and say we got a great option or options. These are the options that are being discussed. A lot of work's being done with it. So the goal really, because we know that this virus lasts a long time outside of the animals, to try to keep mortality on the farm. So rendering is not going to be an option, and you're going to want to avoid contaminating other sites. So we're going to try to keep the mortality on the farm. Some of the options that are being discussed: mass burial, shallow burial, composting, natural in-place decomposition. Let's cover each one of those real quick. We have some additional detailed carcass disposal resources. Once again, at the website that Amanda mentioned, ipic.iastate.edu. For the deep burial, the DNR does have a tool where you can look up land that you may be evaluating to see if it's either green, which means good to go to do deep burial, or if you're in these brown areas, are not eligible for deep burial. So that's some of the things that you could be doing in peacetime. And you can always call the DNR if you need more assistance or want to ask additional questions on that. The one downside to deep burial is one thing that we've learned so far is that if African swine fever gets in the water supply, it takes like a tiny amount of virus to infect pigs. So that is the one concern is that, well, we bury all these carcasses. What happens if the virus seeps out of there and gets into the water supply? That's a real concern for sure. So another option that's being explored to maybe offset that is what's called shallow burial. Now in those cases, you've got a series of long, shallow trenches. Typically, they're about 2 feet deep. So the idea is to keep it away from the water table in case we have bodily fluids that would seep away from there. Essentially what you do here, you see the trenches, you line them on the bottom of, you put a carbon source, you put the animals on top of the carbon source, you cover it back up with dirt, and ideally you farm right over the top of it. Now, currently there's some research being done at South Dakota State and Oklahoma State to see, well, will that process even inactivate the viruses, and how good a job does it do at decomposing the carcasses? So all that kind of stuff is currently underway. Composting is another option. It's an option for some people ready for normal mortalities. So the big question there is, well, if we got to do a 4,000 head finishing site, how long before, you know, how do we get enough carbon source to do that? Yeah, you had a question. What's that? Yep. Nobody knows yet on manure. Now, in fecal material in a plate in a lab, it's only good. It's only alive for 11 days. But I would dare say the conditions in a lab doesn't mimic what happens in a 10-foot deep pit at 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Unfortunately, we don't know that. There are some projects going on over in Vietnam. I don't know if that one is on there to look at survivability, how long, because they have some commercial production units over there that are impacted. We have a really good relationship with the Vietnamese government. So hopefully that's something that will be looked at, but I can't promise that for sure. That's the big unknown, right, is really what to do with deep pitted manure. For composting, though, carbon source is the big question. How much do you have? How quickly can you get it? How much can you get? What are your different options there? So a lot yet to be learned on that. Natural in-place decomposition, so essentially leaving the carcasses in the barn, trying to get rid of all the excess water that would be in those carcasses. I mean, it does contain the virus to the site, hopefully to the point where all you're left with is maybe hides and bones, and then you either bury them or incinerate them or compost them or do something else with that. Now there is IPPA is sponsoring some research at Iowa State University with the ag engineers to look at, well, we had a situation where we did ventilation shutdown plus, could we get those barns up to a temperature high enough to actually inactivate the virus right inside the carcasses? Because then you could say, well, that's going to allow for some additional options. If we know we can prove that, yeah, we had them, but the temperatures exceeded that, for a period of maybe days. So the risk is very, very low. So currently that research is underway to look at, would that be another one? Now this one, while it does check some of the boxes, having to go in afterwards and pick some of that stuff out to get rid of it, I mean, is not a pleasant thought at all, right? So like I say, it's not like there's a lot of good disposal options. Today, these are just some of the things that are being looked at. So what happens? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Several decades ago, foot and mouth disease was in Great Britain.
Yep.
And they had to kill a lot of animals.
Yep.
And they burned them.
Yep, they did.
Comment on that.
Where it says, good question. So while today that's not something really on the docket, I do know during the exercise, all the state animal health officials have started to have conversations with their local and federal EPA to see if they would grant some waivers for that. I would tell you today, probably the country that's done the best job with that is in Russia, with dealing with African swine fever, and that is what they do. They bury them in big open pits and burn them. So that's, I would say those discussions are underway today. I don't think it's really on the top of mind for the plan, but that's certainly a discussion that's taking place kind of behind closed doors.
Make the commenters about the social component.
Yeah, that's a little bit right of the concern about, well, and really with any of the stuff where we bring the carcasses out, that's where a little bit where the in-barn decomposition holds some value is, yeah, I mean, for the first case, that's one thing they saw with high-path avian influenza, right, is they had the media flying drones over these sites trying to get footage, and it's like, well, we're going to, drag them out. That stuff's probably all going to get, unfortunately, aired. So that was something we'd have to certainly work through. And, I think that's the big thing they're concerned about is from the EPA standpoint is ice going to smell and all this smoke. But I have heard at least they're having those discussions. So, yep.
Got 2,000 sows in the barn. Whose responsibility is it to drag them out?
Yeah.
I mean, and
That's a great question. Yeah.
And you said leave them in there. I don't want to be around dragging out carcasses.
That's right. That's a good question. I mean, ultimately the owner would be responsible for it, but I do know during high-path avian influenza, I believe the state and federal officials, they were able to bring in some teams to help with some of the disposal processes. So those discussions have been taking place, I'm sure, along the same lines.
Owner of the barn or owner of the pigs?
Another good question on that. Yeah. That's all still being worked out. Certainly, that's been a concerning question. We haven't gotten a firm good answer on that yet.
So the thought behind deep burials eventually fires die in the hole?
Yeah, well, or it's at least contained, right? You know, and over time, and I know in some countries, you know, some of them burn them, other ones they'll put like lime and, you know, agents to try to degrade those carcasses over time. But yeah, the thought process is over time, eventually the virus would attack. It could potentially, right? And that's the concern about leaching into the water supply with deep burial. That's a real concern. Yeah.
In Russia, they use they use a lime product.
Yeah. Yep.
When they bury the carcasses.
They try to help. Yep. Speed that process up. Hydrolyze. Yep. There you go. That's the word. Yep. No. Good questions. Permit. So this would be like the video referred. Well, what happens if I'm in this circle here and you know my neighbor's got it, but I don't have it, right? And I got to move feed or pigs because anybody inside that, well, we say circle, but it could be multiple different shapes. But what happens if I'm in one of those quarantine areas? Well, you can move them, but you need to get what's called a movement permit. So what are some of those requirements? They got to have premise identification numbers, so both the origin and the destination. If you're moving pigs or if you're moving feed, the feed mill has to have a premise identification number as well, okay? So once again, stuff that we can be doing here during peacetime. You'll have to demonstrate that the pigs aren't showing any sign of disease, daily mortalities haven't increased, and there'll be some sort of probably combination of live and dead pig testing and ASF negative diagnostic test in order to get one of those movement permits. And then the destination has to be willing to accept those pigs if it's a pig movement. Yes?
There is going to be Iowa State's going to be flooded with diagnostic work at that time. Is there more shifts or other?
Yeah. Yep. Great question. Great question. I would say discussions with Dr. Main and his team, they feel like they can probably ramp up within 24 hours. They can probably be doing about 2,000 tests a day. Now that's going to be the other thing is that everybody's going to want to have their pigs tested even if they're not in quarantine, right? Well, there'll be a prioritization working with the state and federal officials about what samples get tested first. But yeah, that's the big question, right? So things that they've talked about is there's 22 labs like Iowa State that can run those tests. They may have to send them to different areas in order to complete all that testing. Yeah.
How many state vets are there to go around and collect?
Yeah, that's another good question. That certainly is probably a resource. So like in Iowa, you probably speak to this, Jamie, we have the state vet, but then we have several, both USDA area veterinarians in charge and veterinarians that work as veterinary medical officers for the state. You know how many we have here in Iowa?
So there's 3 district veterinarians for USDA and 5 district veterinarians for Iowa.
Right.
Now they also understand that's 8 people, right? That you can overwhelm that system pretty quickly. Sure.
Millions of pigs.
Right. So there's been a lot of planning in some other states that are working towards a certification program that will allow farm personnel to take the scenarios. And that stuff is progressing pretty quickly. So I think you'll find a certified sample collector program happening here pretty rapidly.
And there are actually, we saw the secure pork videos, there are some training videos on there, assuming that oral fluids being one of the primary methods. Now, it's not today, it's not approved, but we've been told shortly after an outbreak it will be, and that will probably be the primary method, I would think, personally. With that, yeah, there is some training videos already in the securepork.org website, you know, that will kind of go through that. But yeah, that's the thought process, and I think that was one of the things they learned during the exercise is like, oh man, we didn't think we did have enough staff. Now we know we really don't have anywhere near the staff. So states are more open to evaluating that. And I would agree with Jamie. I think that's something that will happen. Yeah. Good question. I'd ask your local feed mill. I believe there are some that are. I don't know if they all are.
There's been a significant increase in the number of feed mills that are understanding the role that they play in this response. And we've seen a big increase in Idaho. The number of females that have registered program, maybe
Excellent questions. So it's a process, right? I mean, if the first time you've heard it, like, oh, this can't be real, or you listen to the disposal options, these are all stupid and impractical. It's kind of like the 5 stages of grief, right? Well, if they just keep it out of the border, you're bargaining. Well, no, nothing I do is going to matter. Really want to try to get producers through is help them, get through these first 4 stages and get to this 5th stage. Okay, we know this is a big thing. Let's just, eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? What goals can I make in my farm today to help get ready? So also on the website, we have kind of a series of action checklists. So these are some good peacetime activities, and then just kind of a worksheet to say, well, I'm going to give myself 1 task a month that I'm going to complete. So maybe the first thing you say, by the end of the month, I want to make sure that I have verified my pins are correct for all my sites. And maybe next month is I talk to my feed supplier to make sure they have premise identification, right? We've got a series of checklists of stuff you can do for your farm, but it's just so that we're trying to do as much as this as we can now, rather than waiting to the outbreak and everybody's flurrying and scurrying, try to get some of these things put in place. So once again, you saw on there, ipic.iastate.edu. You click on this, you'll see the FAD prep guide. If you go a little bit lower in the news, you'll see Dr. Character's ractopamine discussions. And then if you click on that link, that's going to bring you to this additional web information that Kristen's done a great job of getting some additional resources for you. I'll give you just an example. Click on resources, you click on feed ingredients. There's a series of taped presentations, holding time calculations for feed, so on and so forth. So tons of material there for you to use. So with that, I'll answer any quick questions. I think I had a couple. Go ahead.
So last year, I think we worked on all these maps.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't all that in place now?
Yep. The secure pork, that certainly is yep, that's what we did on the first workshops, because at that time, the understanding was you had to have a completed plan, or that would help you get a permit. Well, when we did the exercise, the state vets at that time, it was very state to state dependent, but some said, well, are we going to file those, or what are we going to do with them? So they didn't necessarily make that a part of the permitting process, okay? But any preparation that we do is good, and secure pork is a good way to get prepared. There's been discussions about now, even in the state of Iowa, to say they're still looking at how would we go about verifying these plans. What we might do is just rely on your veterinarian to go through, and you guys work on that plan together, work through that checklist, and then sign off on it. And that may have eventually what gets filed. It's a little bit fuzzy. I can't give you a good answer on that, but yeah, working through that secure pork thing would be a good preparation. We're just saying on any of that other kind of stuff, we're just providing more materials to get that kind of stuff ready.
What's the turnaround on? What do you expect a turnaround on that
Permit?
What do you like feed?
Yep.
As the pigs get older, they're eating 12 tons every 5
Right.
days.
Yep. So that's a tricky point, right? Because the animal health officials they're trying to balance, because we know, remember, it took 2 weeks before the farm could even see that something was different. So they're trying to balance the risk of that movement, but they do recognize that there's a welfare consideration there, right? So it's a fine balance. Now, the one good thing about having prepared, getting all that stuff ready, and secure pork is a good way to do that, is that you'll have all that information ready for a movement permit to be applied. But they understand that the feed one is critical, and even on like the standstill order, it's probably going to be dependent on what the nature of the outbreak looks like, whether or not feed's involved. But they're aware, they're cognizant that feed's going to be an issue. If you got a situation like that, that's going to be something that they factor in about approving those permits. But I think the turnaround, once you get it in and they do the evaluation, as long as everything's on the permit and they feel like they have all the necessary information, they can turn that around fairly quick. But you saw those 6 things on there, right? That's all stuff that you can have a lot of that stuff prepared today so that you're ready to submit that permit. Yeah, go ahead.
This type of a meeting is good, and I'm glad you're doing this all over the state of Iowa to be prepared.
Yep.
But what in the world is going on to keep coming here in the first
Yeah,
place?
yep.
How would it get here?
Yep.
And what's being done at our borders
You bet.
to keep it from getting here in the first place? To me, that's as well, it's more important than this.
Sure. But, okay, so once again, because I'm squeezing 3 hours into 30 minutes, I didn't really cover that. There's plenty of resources in there. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of that. And that's part of the thing is like, let's be prepared. But there's a lot going on, right? So one of it is, if I looked at it based on all the information we have, there's two ways primarily that the virus would get into the country. One is through those contaminated pork products, slips through, customs, and accidentally or intentionally finds its way into pigs.
Are we importing pork products right now?
Not from any ASF infected country.
But we are from other countries.
From other countries, we do, like casings and a little bit of pork. It's not a lot, but not from any countries that are infected with African swine fever in commercial units today, okay? So the bigger concern is about the travelers that might bring it in, okay? So NPPC's lobby to get additional dog teams. The dog teams are our best defense, right? They, at most of the airports, like in DC, Dulles, they confiscate 400 to 600 pounds every day of agriculture products that are attempting to be smuggled in. Now, that's not all meat, that's not all pork, but that's all. So it'd be enough to probably cover these 3 tables. That's 365 days a year. That's how much stuff that they find. So the dogs, by far and away, are our best first defense. So what they do is, and I think through some risk analysis, they've identified like the 5 airports that represent about 90% of the risk. So as everybody gets off the plane and goes to pick up their luggage, they'll circle, those dog teams will circle that 3 or 4 times, smelling everybody's luggage before you pass through customs. So, and NPPC was able to successfully lobby, I think, to get another 60 dog teams. Now, each one of those dogs and their trainer cost about $125,000, right? So we're not talking pennies to do that. So that certainly that's probably some of our best defense to keep it out from that standpoint. But probably the second biggest risk is going to be feed ingredients, right? So on the website, there's a whole bunch of things that we resourced that we didn't have time to get into today. There's things such as they're evaluating different ingredients, as far as the risk, so talk to your feed mills so they can talk to their suppliers and say, well, if you can get choline, but you can get it from China or you can get it from somewhere in South America, we probably ought to be trying to get it from South America, right? So a lot of those conversations are ongoing. There's a lot more about biosecurity practices. So if they are bringing in ingredients from China, some feed mills or some feed suppliers are bringing that in and quarantining that for 90 or 150 days in storage temperatures, at like room temperature or higher, maybe 70, 80 degrees. Because even if there was accidental contamination, if you held it for that time period at that temperature, that virus would degrade and die out over time. The third thing that can happen is, and some producers are doing active mitigation. So they're adding compounds to the feed that if we had an accidental introduction may inactivate that virus. We don't know for sure because the research hasn't been done. It's been effective for PED and some other things, but may be effective at killing the virus if it ever did get inside feed ingredients.
So we're currently importing feed ingredients from China.
Yes. Yep.
And wouldn't it be something if that's what started?
Right. That was a concern with PED, right? They were fairly convinced that look, comparing viruses and timing and all, that may have been one of the ways to do that. So what you're seeing is there's been a lot of work to try to minimize those ingredients, the importation of those ingredients, and additional things that they can do on farm to try to minimize that contamination. Now, the good news is with a lot of those products, they're made in like human grade facilities, right? So the idea that you're going to get infected pig blood into those, probably fairly low, but it doesn't mean that it's not zero, right? So that's just part of the world that we live in. With some of those ingredients, the only place in the world that it's produced is in China. So we're somewhat hamstrung by the fact that for some of those compounds, we just don't even have alternatives.